Last October, I was going around class and my students were all being very good. They had their head in their books, they were taking notes. And I stopped and I asked one of them, do you need any help? And he said, nah, I'm fine. I got it, thanks. And I was thrilled. Because you see, for me, I am in the business of making myself obsolete. It is when a student no longer needs me that I know that I have done my job. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is this young woman with this great ambition of becoming obsolete going to have any suggestions about how to improve an arcane education system? So let me do a little bit of explaining. First, I would agree, you are right. The Myanmar education system, arcane, obsolete, you can really choose any number of words that you find appropriate. It does very little for Myanmar students. Many have just come through their matriculation exams, and the university students are just in the thick of it. They get one day off, where they probably have to go to the pagoda with their family, and then they'll go back and take more exams. And what they've learned throughout the years, when they were in first standard, fourth standard, eighth standard, 10th standard, was that questions are obstacles. Questions bring them glory or shame. But questions also can be their ticket to continuing a successful life, or they prove to be the end of the road. Now, this is true for a variety of reasons. In an education system where resources have become ever fewer and the number of students ever greater, memorization has become the primary means of knowledge transfer. Outside of the classroom, however, stakes were higher, questions were dangerous, and answers were elusive. And then, of course, there is always the tradition that you should listen to those who have lived longer than you and presumably know more. And the past may or may not be behind us, but the present and the future pose new challenges. With an ever-increasing cost of living, families need their children to become successful breadwinners. What you wanted to study, there's no time for that. However, the benefits of these very tight systems is there's always a few discrepancies that manage to make it out, a few grains of sand that manage to slip through the fingers. And so I'm fortunate enough to be at one of those programs now. And all of our energies are focused on having students to switch their attitudes about questions. Questions are not obstacles, nor are questions a pastime. Questioning for us is a lifestyle. So I'd like to speak today mostly about one particular student who is like so many others. Thura was a student of ours last year. He comes from a typical middle-class urban background. He's not from Yangon, but his family moved here when he was in middle school in order to afford him better educational opportunities. Many of you probably know what this transition entails. It means switching from the town to the city, switching from one government school to the next, where hopefully you have more teachers per capita, just a few, and adding in a few extra tuitions. And that's the extent of that education reform. In spite of all of this, Thura did not make the grade to continue on the most successful track of going to medical school or engineering school. His scores qualified him for what we call in English, lower computer university. Needless to say, he was not enthused by this option. Despite protests from his family, He chose not to enroll. What he was going to do next, he wasn't very sure. Would he work? Would he volunteer? Would he go and pursue a series of certificates? But as luck or fate and a mutual friend certainly would have it, he ended up at one of our Saturday discussions that we hold for anyone who is bold and curious enough to come by. And that week was a rather special week. We had an acquaintance from Silicon Valley, an entrepreneur, come and give a talk. So this very mid-50s, might be early 60s now, very accomplished, educated man, and so he talks for 15 minutes. And then he stopped. Wasn't he going to talk more? He didn't. Something very unusual happened. The students in the audience started asking questions. They asked a lot of questions. When they stopped asking questions, he said, "Do you have any more questions?" Something started to flip in Thora's mind. So some months later, Thora was able to join us full-time at our program, and his tenacity for asking questions only started and continued to grow. After history class, which was a subject he had thoroughly and admittedly despised in high school, he would follow his history teacher and ask him questions of ideas that had come up and things that he never got to follow up on because there simply wasn't enough time. He had to know, he had to get more knowledge about what had been shared. On our first field trip, late into the afternoon after we'd all been sweating buckets, Thora and his partner could be found talking to the distribution manager of the plastic factory. How did they get the plastics in from a variety of countries? How did they get the plastic bags out? He was already developing such a handle on that first skill of asking questions, which is using them to acquire knowledge. Knowledge you never knew you could get and maybe didn't even know you wanted. But soon that wasn't enough. Some months later, we were at the National Museum looking at how it fits into the national narrative. And so he and his partner are going around and they're examining the exhibits. What do they say about Myanmar? What do they not say about Myanmar? And then they look at each other and they think, this museum is terribly uncomfortable. So then they decide that they want to answer a different question. They go up and down the 4 stories multiple times. They interview their other classmates who are doing their research as well. And they submit a report that examines the question, how do we make the museum more hospitable for visitors? It included simple things like they need more air conditioning, they need more light for the paintings, and they need more accurate ethnic dioramas. So within his first 6 months, Thora had gone through this tremendous transition of questions no longer being obstacles. They were his tools. They were his tools for getting knowledge, and they were starting to become his tools for solving problems. But then the last step, the next, moving from the tangible to the intangible. Not just how are we going to solve problems, but how are we going to live? Who am I going to be, and what relationships will I have? This came out in August when we went down to the Delta following the floods. We went down to a village where one of our teachers, one of the maids in his house, was from that village and knew it had been affected. And the family was bringing down bags and bags of rice. And so we tagged along, bringing a gaggle of students and notebooks. And the students went around and were accumulating knowledge and trying to solve problems. So they were asking things like, what is your primary crop? How will you buy seed or grow for next year now that this crop has been washed out? How have your children been affected? Are they still able to go to school? And so Thura learned all of these things and also put together a plan of how they wanted to spend their funds. But his greatest takeaway manifested itself some weeks later. He had written an essay to apply to colleges, and he wrote about this trip. He wrote about how it had changed him. And so I want to read for you guys now what he had written. I was always unsatisfied with what I owned. I was chasing after luxuries as a means of pleasure. After comparing my life to that of the villagers, I realized how lucky I was. I realized I was living a very comfortable life. I never had to worry about my food or shelter. Besides, I had not even had to worry about things such as a laptop and phone. Plus, I had never even worked for these things. However, I had always ignored that fact. We know that we can learn better how to live from other people. But it is only when you go out and ask questions of what you want to see and what you want to hear and what you're curious about that you have any way of capitalizing on that. And this really shows how dramatic Thura's transition was. So if you want to change the education system in Myanmar, it's really not all that hard. It's simply a switch in the students' attitudes about what questions are. Questions are not obstacles. They are not roadblocks. Questions are tools that allow you to learn what you have never known. They allow you to connect with people you never anticipated understanding. And they allow you to do things that you never thought you could. If you want the students of Myanmar to become capable people of making their own future, this is all that they really need. And this is the grave importance of inquiry. I would like to continue with their final project, which I think demonstrates this very well. They were writing a Myanmar history textbook. Yes, this is a metaphor, and yes, it's also very true. So in their last 6 weeks of academic classes, the students had to write a Myanmar history all their own. All I had done was set something of a timeline, given them teams, and required a copious number of sources. But it was they who went out and they found the sources. They organized everything that they wanted to know. They decided how they wanted that narrative to go. They wrote the words. It was their story. So they have written their past, and I know very well that they're equally capable of writing their own future. Some of the alumni of the program are a strong testament to just how capable one person can become when they have this lifestyle of asking questions. One of them is the managing director of an office that is advising companies on the political situation of their investments so that money is best placed for sustainable development in Myanmar. One of them, who will follow me on the stage today, is the CEO of a documentary company that is showing people from Myanmar, in Myanmar, and outside in the greater world, from Japan to the US, what is going on in this country in ways that nobody has seen before. And one of them is very much about to outdo us at our own game. He is going to start a full-time, 4-year liberal arts bachelor's program in Myanmar, which will hopefully create many more of these question askers. So I'd like to leave you all today with a proverb. Many of you have probably heard this expression that if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you can feed him for a lifetime. When it comes to education, we must apply the same thinking to questions. If you ask a child a question, they will generally learn for at least one day. If you teach a child to question, they will learn for a lifetime. Thank you.